Hi, Doctors Dean and TeamSherzai, and welcome to the Real Truth About Weight Loss Summit. Thank you so much for being here. You're our first husband and wife interview. It's so exciting.
Thank you so much for having us, Chef AJ. We've admired your work for such a long time, and it's so exciting to be here and speaking with you.
This is going to be great because, we focus so much on what to eat, but you're the first people that are really going to be focusing on the brain. As neurologists, can you tell us, how does being overweight or obese affect our brain health?
So anything that has to do with metabolism in any way is going to affect the brain first and most. I mean, this is the most active organ in the body. It's a small little organ. Many people who've heard us talk have heard this little spiel. It's 3 pounds, 2% of body's weight, but at any one point consumes 25% of body's energy and even more oxygen. And so it's a constantly a needy organ. It wants food, it wants energy, it wants oxygen, it wants all the nutrients, and it wants it in the right form, amount, and if it doesn't get it, although in short term you might actually see different kind of patterns, and I'm kind of giving a clue as far as some of these new fads that are coming up, but in long term it damages this brain profoundly. So this organ is going to be fed 3 to 4 times a day.
Yeah.
And each meal, I mean, we have to say this, each single meal, it's not like cumulative, but each single meal can either build the brain or break the brain, because each single meal affects 87 billion neurons. Each single meal affects 1 quadrillion connections. Each single meal can profoundly affect the brain, although you won't feel it, but it is a cumulative process. And eventually, for some earlier, through autoimmune processes in the brain, through effects such as depression, anxiety, and all of those things, which are related to food. But long-term, in degenerative processes such as stroke and Alzheimer's and other types of dementia, it will always manifest. And we believe that the dominant factor there is food. And why obesity and overweight as a marker? Because that tells you what you've done with food over time. I mean, by the way, whenever we make this talk, everybody thinks that or there's somebody that says that, are you blaming people? Absolutely not. We're hoping to empower people with that knowledge. And also, since we're behaviorists, I'm a neurobehaviorist, to give them the tools to get out of this morass and to get control over this incredible problem, which is obesity and weight loss or weight gain, which is destroying the brain even ahead of your liver, kidney, everything else.
That's incredible. So it's not actually just being overweight or obese that is causing people to have brain disease. It's the food that they ate to create the overweight or obese body.
Absolutely.
Wow. And what food is that?
Well, we've known for a long time, and I know that you're the expert in this, and you are always, disseminating this information. As it happens, foods that are highly processed are incredibly harmful. Foods that are high in calorie and low in nutrient density seem to, destroy the very infrastructure of the brain. And on the contrary, when we eat, foods that are unprocessed, plant-based, so a whole food plant-based diet, regardless of what they are, in combination provides the right kind of micronutrients, macronutrients, all the minerals and supplements in the world in a beautiful synergistic way to the brain, and the body recognizes it uses it, and it creates the building blocks of the brain. And whether it's studies from the United States, from all over the world, for a very, very long time, whatever dietary pattern you look at, the unprocessed plants play an incredibly helpful role in providing nutrition for the brain.
I love how you said that every meal literally builds the brain or breaks the brain. So it's almost like a whole food plant-based diet is a build a brain workshop.
It is. It's medicine. We call it foodicine. I've trademarked that term. So it's food from it's better than any pill. I mean, here's the dilemma we've had is there are some other people that have done work on brain and have written books, and behind the scene, it's a funneling mechanism towards their vitamins. There is no vitamin better than food. because in food, you get vitamins and minerals in a synergistic way. Now, more and more, what we've been saying is, it's coming out that, more than any vitamin that you could take orally, if you eat a proper diet, and the operative term here is proper diet. I mean, even vegan diet can be, we know many people eat vegan diets are incredibly bad. But a whole food plant-based diet that's planned well and is all inclusive, it's better than any medicine you could ever get, because the data shows that if you get a vitamin orally, you're not getting it in proper amounts that the body needs. Its absorption is affected. It's not being taken in a way where it's working with other vitamins, which is how it's supposed to be. How do you get all that in that synergistic right quantity way? In food, in a complex food approach. So we although it's not sexy, because telling them that you take this incredible biohacking vitamin and with certain kind of juice, it's going to build your brain. It's not like that. Just eating proper food does more for your brain than any hacking, biohacking that's out there.
So many people hear that our brain is made out of fat, therefore they surmise that we need a lot of fat, or they hear that they're supposed to eat a lot of fish for brain health or fish oil. What say you on that issue?
Oh, that is the question that keeps coming back over and over again. And we love answering it, don't get me wrong. But, it's such a false notion when people say that. We always hear people saying, well, more than 70% of your brain is fat. So you need fat to create, those brain connections. But the kind of fat that is in our brain, well, first of all, it's much less than that. It's not storage fat. It's not meant for metabolism. It's structural fat. So the cells, the cell walls, the cell connections, the myelin sheaths, which are the covering of the nerves, the insulation around the nerves, they're all created from fats. But when we're hungry and the brain needs energy, it doesn't use that fat. That structural integrity is always there. We need to replace it with omega-3 fatty acids that are plentiful in nuts and seeds and whole foods, whole plant foods. That's basically it. And more importantly, when you look at the brain, this 3-pound organ, it's only 2% of the body's weight. It's created from many, many blood vessels. If we had to span all the blood vessels that are in the brain, and they've calculated this, it would cover 400 miles. So we have 400 miles worth of arteries in this brain, and it's lined by the endothelium, and it has the same structure that that the arteries in our heart and our kidneys and the rest of the bodies have. Imagine what fat does to the lining of those arteries. So before it even gets to the cell and to the metabolic areas and the crucial areas of the brain, we're actually damaging a lot of arteries with all that fat. So no, we don't need to eat a lot of fat for brain health. And the kind of fat is also important. The kind of fat that has been studied and is healthful for brain is all plant-based. It's the poly and monounsaturated fats that are derived from avocados, from nuts and seeds, from, other vegetables. But again, in small quantities, not a lot.
Now, what's unique about the brain is the vasculature. It's the most vascular organ in the body by far. It doesn't even, other organs don't even come close. And on top of that, the vasculature actually with endothelial lining creates what's called a blood-brain barrier. So brain and the central nervous system is in this hermetic environment, well enclosed. It's very difficult for even bacteria to get through. And so that lining and that protection is incredibly tenuous and incredibly important. When you damage it with fat, and we know this story, Essie and others have done the work, and many and ourselves, we've looked into this as well. When you damage that endothelial lining with fat, you're not only damaging the vessels, you're actually making the blood-brain barrier porous. So now that's open to infections and all kinds of things. So it's even more important when it comes to brain. So the idea that the brain is made of fat, therefore anything is meaningless. It doesn't need fat. It actually creates its own fat, and it's structural fat. It doesn't have a storage fat. And on top of that, the omega-3s that it needs, we can get from regular food just as well. Now, on top of that, the damage that you do on the way there with even minimal fat is profound. It's long, not even long term, short term. We know that when people have a certain amount of fat, their neurotransmitter mechanisms are changed. That's just one element, let alone the fact that we know that it affects our mood, and when it comes to depression, anxiety, all of these things, which we'll talk to in a second. But that statement is by far the most hyperbolic, meaningless statement I've ever heard as a neurologist.
You asked a question specifically about fish because everybody thinks that omega-3 fatty acids are derived, from fish source. Fish, when you look at the data, people don't need to eat fish necessarily, because all of the dietary patterns that have looked at the importance of omega-3 fats look at omega-3, whether it's derived from fish or anything else. We now know that people who consume fish are exposed to more mercury, lead, and other heavy metals, and we only check maybe 2 or 3, contaminants. I imagine all the other contaminants that we throw in the ocean, we don't even worry about that. So we say skip the fish, and if you are concerned about omega-3 fatty acids, try to get it from the source, which is algae. But eating a variety of a whole food plant-based diet should cover your needs for omega-3 fatty acids.
And the positive, as far as data is concerned, you always see positive results when it comes to fish. That's true.
Yeah.
As a scientist, we have to say, but the problem with that is that the comparison group matters. They always compare fish to meat, fish to processed food. We did the studies in Adventist Health Study. And we looked at cognition and the different diet types and a sample of population, and it worked the same way. It was plant-based first, and then pescatarian, and then omnivores. So when you look at population data and others, and you have an appropriate comparison group, fish is not any more superior. The problem is comparison groups.
Wow. Some people, though, are promoting a ketogenic diet for brain health, and even for claiming it prevents and even reverses Alzheimer's disease.
So we just wrote an article that's going to be published in Planted and some other. As scientists, we have to be open to research and data. So some of our friends are looking at ketogenic diet, in plant-based ketogenic diet, and others, and we're definitely open to it. We're a little incredulous from several different ways, and that's a bias that should not stop us from being open to things. But there is absolutely no data that a animal-based ketogenic diet is of any benefit. There's no data. The longest data study that shows benefits from ketogenic diet on brain health is 6 months. And I in jest, I say that 6 months means nothing. Some of our friends are going to be doing some cognitive studies on that are 6 months, and actually it's a disservice. You can look at somebody and smile for 6 months and their brain function will get better. Doesn't mean that that's an underlying mechanism. 6 months is nothing. Show me anything longer than that, and there's nothing longer than that. And that's important because it doesn't speak to mechanism if it's not longer than 6 months. The other thing about ketogenic diet, now, if you look at the mechanisms, and we love this because we're actually creating a podcast presentation around, and we'll share with you. Glucose, I call it, serial dating kind of a thing versus a stable relationship. So, sorry, it's comparison. So let's take glucose. This poor molecule, it's initially in a long chain. It gets broken down in the mouth and the stomach. Then it has to get through the stomach lining into the blood vessels. And then from there, it has to connect to specific receptors to go through the blood-brain barrier. Then it gets into the nervous system. Then the right amount of these glucose molecules, or let's say suitors, have to be around the door of the neuron. If there's too many of them, the receptor goes in. If there's few, it doesn't work. So the right amount of it has to be there. And once the right amount of glucose is there, then the insulin comes and unlocks the door. And then the glucose molecule is not done yet. Then it has to go to the tyrosine kinase pathway, then phosphorylation, 6-7 other pathways before it gets to the mitochondria. Imagine that as a dating process where you go to the to the house of the person you're trying to date, and then the father, then the grandfather, then the uncle, and That's a lot of work just to get into the cell. And then to get into the mitochondria, you even have to do more work. But that's what's needed. And then once it gets to the mitochondria, it is broken down efficiently into ATP, lots of ATP, 36, into water, and then carbon dioxide, which is sent out. That's an efficient breakdown product without inflammation, with proper usage, without any excessive byproduct. Now let's look at ketones. These small molecules, which get through the cell without ever binding a receptor, get through the blood-brain barrier, jump through the window into the house, and it's like a one-night relationship. Okay, you feel good initially. Not that I've ever done that, but let's say you feel good initially, and they feel high energy. They actually lose weight. Their insulin resistance is stabilized for a little bit, but long term, we know there's inflammation. Long term, we know there's amyloid deposition. We know there's damage long term. So why is it that people don't want to see that fact that there's long term and short term differences? So we worry that this incredible movement, which is actually driven by confirmation bias, because young men want to believe that bacon is good for you, and they create the science, and it's not true science, are pushing a concept that there's no data for.
Right.
And it comes from a disease model, from an epilepsy model into regular life model to everybody else.
Wow, that's incredible. It just seems that there's been such an increase in both dementia and Alzheimer's. Why is that, and how can we protect ourselves?
Well, a couple of things. We're seeing more and more because, we have better diagnostic techniques. We have MRIs, people are actually being tested. But the other thing is we're getting older, we're living longer, and we've created systems and medications that treat chronic diseases of aging, but not necessarily improve quality of life. And brain health always falls apart. People actually don't address brain health, generally speaking. And so you have people getting medication for diabetes and high blood pressure and high cholesterol, but you have not really treated the underlying cause of these chronic diseases of aging. So the process of the pathogenesis continues, and that causes damage to the brain. And the brain is pretty sensitive to these vascular markers. If your sugar levels are abnormal, if your cholesterol is abnormal. So I think that's one of the reasons why we're seeing more and more of it. I mean, right now, the statistics are pretty scary. More than 5.8 million people in the United States have Alzheimer's disease. Every 64 seconds, someone is diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. And 2/3 of them are women for various reasons, because the cohort that is coming now to us are women who were probably not really exposed to preventive measures, and so that's why we see more and more of it right now.
There are four basic mechanisms, right? So it's inflammation, oxidation, glucose dysregulation, and lipid dysregulation. I mean, what affects those mechanisms? Food.
Lifestyle.
Lifestyle and food in particular.
Yeah.
Let's take one of those, insulin and insulin resistance or glucose dysregulation. We did a study, a nationwide study, that looked at insulin resistance, not even diabetes. We're talking about pre-diabetes. And when you looked at insulin resistance and compared to cognition, those who had insulin resistance had actually lower cognitive state. So even prior to diabetes, that affects the brain. So and what's the biggest epidemic right now? Diabetes and prediabetes. We're talking about even in kids, it's an epidemic of diabetes and prediabetes. We just read a paper on the effect of the insulin resistance on adolescents.
Yeah, absolutely. So just a couple of weeks ago, a paper came out that showed that obesity in adolescents is associated with inflammation in the brain. And they did studies where they looked at the brain levels of inflammation, and they did structural MRIs, and they also measured their brain insulin resistance. So even at that young age, when the brain is growing, when new connections are being made, when the stability of decision-making capacity, processing of information, and encoding memory is being created, the brain is actually experiencing inflammation. It was a pretty disturbing paper.
We actually want to start talking more and more about younger and younger age. We know what effect it has long term, but guess what? It has an effect at the two ends even. So it has an effect on throughout life. We're talking about obesity and all the markers of it, which is insulin resistance, diabetes, hypertension, cholesterol, and all of these things. Throughout life, it affects you, but you see the manifestation of it at the two ends. Why? Because we're most vulnerable at those two ends. In childhood, your brain is growing at such an immense rate that by age 5, you have more neurons than you will ever have. And then there's actually a programmed cell death that leaves the infrastructure. At that time, when you're growing your brain, and then after that, up to age 20 or 20, up to 25, you're myelinating all the neurons. At that point, the thing that makes the myelination or protects you is food. And we have an epidemic of diabetes. We have an epidemic of prediabetes, and nobody's talking about it. And we ask ourselves, why is there also an epidemic of depression, anxiety, ADD? Well, don't you think some of that is related to the food we're eating?
Absolutely.
So I think it's critical that we start talking about this and how food is affecting our children and how food is affecting us later in life profoundly more than anything else.
What are the different types of dementia, and are certain types more linked to being overweight than others?
So we have dementia. That's dementia in general means when you have cognitive decline to the extent where you can't do your daily activities. That's basically a blunt definition. So the major category is Alzheimer's. About 70% of all dementias is Alzheimer's. How is that distinct? It is more short-term memory than long-term memory initially, but then of course it progresses and involves everything. You have frontotemporal lobe dementia, which is more frontal lobe and temporal lobe, which means behavior changes or language changes. You have Parkinson's and dementia. You have Lewy body dementia, which is visuospatial and hallucinations and Parkinsonian symptoms. And then you have vascular dementia and many others. The one that all of them are affected by obesity and nutrition. But the one that's, of course, dominant in this is vascular dementia, which along that line is strokes and vascular dementia. And vascular dementia is where enough of the vessels are damaged where a person becomes demented. And the kind of dementia is, we after I say this, people will recognize, I hope Aisha and I in parties were not that fun because we can recognize these little subtle changes, but slowness in talking, slowness in walking, and that's a vascular dementia, and it just progresses. And we see profound epidemics, especially in certain region, in certain socioeconomic population where there is no access to information or good food. We work in a free clinic or a low-income clinic once a week where we see 30-year-olds, 40-year-olds with strokes and vascular dementia, which is unheard of. And we are seeing them by the dozens.
Right.
That's unbelievable. I mean, we know from like Dr. Esselstyn, who's also an expert on this summit, that heart disease, even end stage, can be reversed. But with Alzheimer's or dementia, can it be reversed or can it only be prevented?
Oh my goodness. So it's important for us to distinct the two. We know for sure that dementia can be prevented. We, in our book, said 90% of dementia and Alzheimer's disease, to be specific, because it's the biggest category, can be prevented. Now, once the disease has progressed to, different stages of Alzheimer's disease, there is absolutely no data that Alzheimer's disease can be reversed. I think it's very clear because there are some doctors who are making that claim,
yes,
and who are making a living out of that. And I think it's inappropriate to play with people's hopes and give them false hopes. By the time the brain degeneration is extended to that period, there's only so much one can do. However, you can definitely slow down the progression of the disease with a whole food plant-based diet, and that's what we do in our clinic.
And pre-dementia, which is called mild cognitive impairment, and also with vascular dementia, or especially early on, you can definitely reverse those. Yeah. And that's enough of a factor to highlight, because it's the fastest growing epidemic. If we identify the early signs and we start implementing lifestyle changes, the cost of Alzheimer's or dementia in general is $540 billion. The second costliest disease is heart disease at $120 billion. Cancers, all of them combined are nearly $60 billion. So you have 500 billion direct and indirect costs, and then you have 120 billion. And if we can even push it back 5 years or stop about half of them from progressing to the point of fulminant Alzheimer's, we will have done more for our healthcare system than any other project ever in history. So that's why the impetus is to stop it before it starts. Now, for us, we were asked, there was an incredible push for us to make this subtle claim that, yeah, we might be able to reverse Alzheimer's, because by just saying that, or even implying that, we would have sold a million more books. But it's not ethical. And as neurologists who've been working at this for more than a decade, we know that what it means to have fulminant Alzheimer's. You can slow it down at that point, but reversing it is going to be it's going to be impossible. But let's focus on preventing. That's the thing we can do the easiest.
Have you seen any improvement in any of your patients when they've adopted a whole food plant-based diet?
All the time. One of our favorite statements is the fog has lifted. The people come in with varying levels of cognitive impairment. We work with all age groups and mostly with patients who have mild cognitive impairment. And we've seen dozens and dozens of people who have scored lower. And after a few months and a couple of years of being on program, especially focusing on diet and, losing some weight if they are overweight, there's such an huge impact on the way they think, on the way they speak, the way they enjoy life. They feel sharper. We have objective evidence that their neuropsychological scores, those memory scores that they do before and after, they get better. And even their brain looks better when we do MRIs. Most of them have some, what we call white matter disease, which is inflammation around the vessels. And you see some level of improvement there. Obviously, it takes a long time. For brain health, it's not something like a cholesterol level. It takes consistency, but the one thing that comes back really quickly is that sharpness. They feel sharper and they feel the haze going away.
And there are many studies that have shown that even something as simple as exercise, for those who had MCI, which is pre-dementia, 48% reduction, and they were completely reversed in their symptomology and avoidance of disease altogether. But we've done this in our clinics, and now we're in charge of the largest community-based brain health initiative in the country in beach cities, where we're studying 1,700 people and the effect of a combined lifestyle, including nutrition, whole food plant-based nutrition, on brain health and avoiding Alzheimer's and other dementias.
So you mentioned exercise, and it's not something that we focused on a lot at the summit. It's mostly the food that the speakers have been saying you can't outrun a bad diet, although we feel it's very important. But you're saying that when it comes to dementia or Alzheimer's, it's really important that we exercise. So what's the dose? How much do we have to do? Because I find it's easier to get people to eat a whole food plant-based diet than it is after a lifetime of inactivity to get them to start moving.
Very true. The way we describe it is, nutrition provides the right kind of environment for your brain to grow, to thrive, and to heal itself. Nutrition, a whole food plant-based diet actually creates the most beautiful environment for the brain to have the necessary micronutrients and food products to start healing itself. What exercise does is it actually pushes the brain to make more connections. Now, the brain cells can make as little as 2 connections between each other, and these connections translate into transfer of information and creation of memory, decision-making, speed of processing of information, or they can make as many as 30,000 connections. Exercise creates brain growth hormones and neurochemicals that creates these connections. So combination of nutrition and exercise is very important for improving brain capacity and prevention of disease.
But without good nutrition, you can run all day and nothing will happen.
Yeah.
Because the environment is not there for growth. In fact, the environment is there for decay.
Yeah.
So nutrition is central. Then exercise and mental activity, especially certain types of mental activity that create those connections. So all of it is needed but the background is good nutrition.
Yeah, we always give an analogy of, a building that needs maintenance. If we, most people who are overweight and who have vascular risk factors are in damage control mode. Forget about fixing the walls and the windows of the building. Most of the construction workers are around it trying to prevent damage around it. Nobody has time to actually fix the building. But when we provide the right nutritional programs and exercise, the building can actually get fixed properly, and it'll thrive.
That's a great analogy. I heard you say that the leg muscles in particular are important. Could you talk a little bit about that and really how much exercise, what's the minimum daily requirement?
So again, this data comes from many studies. So at this point, one of the favorite statements we have is to the best of our knowledge today, which means it's okay if it adapts and changes over time. But to the best of our knowledge today, about 150 minutes of strenuous exercise per week. Now, that can be broken down on over 5 days, 6 days, not 7. You need a day of rest and restoration, but about 30 minutes a day, 5 days a week would be great. But you have to get tired. And whenever we ask our patients, they say, "Oh, Dean, I'm fine." It's usually a guy who says, "I'm fine. I'm walking the neighborhood and I'm gardening. I'm fine." I said, "That's not exercise. That's meditation." You got to get tired. You got to get short of breath. Now, by that, you don't have to measure your pulse and then subtract your age and all of that. If you have difficulty finishing a sentence, that's good enough. So you have to get tired. The second thing is you have to move throughout the day. Movement is critical. You have to create an environment in your home, at work, where you're moving. And even if you've worked out 30 minutes, but then you sit 8 hours in a row or 6 hours in a row, you've negated the benefit. So you got to move throughout the day. In fact, the blue zones, Dan, a friend of ours who did the work on blue zones, the people there in those places, they didn't exercise. They just moved throughout the day. So that's as important. And the third element is leg strength. Leg strength seems to be correlated with brain strength. Those who had bigger legs had bigger brains. And that wasn't just an incidental correlation. Even when they did studies going forward or twin studies, they showed the same things. Two sisters, multiple sisters, the ones that had bigger legs, had worked out their legs, had bigger brains, even when they controlled for other variables. It makes sense because the biggest pump in your body is not your heart. It's your legs. The biggest surface area of metabolism are your legs. And then when you work out your legs, the muscle that actually pushes your brain to create BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which is a growth hormone, is most affected by leg strength. And then fourth, aside from this as tangential thing is, as we get older, the main reason that people end up in the hospital long-term is falls and head traumas and you broke. And the thing that keeps you stable the most is leg strength. So if you're going to do any anaerobic exercise or strengthening exercise, please do leg strength exercises. And I don't mean squats. I mean, don't put weights on your shoulder. I'm not a big fan of that. But mini squats, lunges, or just using those machines in the right amount just to strengthen the legs.
And the amount of exercise that has been studied to be good and beneficial for the brain is 150 minutes per week. So
yeah.
Wow, that's amazing. I like to spin. Is that good for leg strength? I spin standing up. I don't sit down. I stand the whole time.
That's the best. Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, good. I'm glad because my mom did have Alzheimer's, and I'm going to do everything I can to not succumb to that. I know you guys are both physicians at Loma Linda, where Dr. Ellsworth Wareham practiced for many years. He was almost 105 when he peacefully passed away. I actually had him as a guest on my television show, and he was sharp as a tack in his hundreds.
Yes.
Is cognitive decline always necessary when we age, or is it possible to be an Ellsworth Wareham?
Not at all. No. So one of the myths that we want to dispel is just that aging or getting older is synonymous with having memory problems, and that's absolutely not true. As a matter of fact, when you look at older textbooks, the term senile dementia is always used over and over again, but that has changed. We have great examples of people who have aged, well into their 90s and beyond, that were and are very, very sharp. And the concept of successful cognitive aging is not just, it's not a thing, it's a reality. And Dean actually studied that when he was a postdoc at UC San Diego, what that essentially means. And, when you look at the blue zones and other parts of the world, even, scientists and artists and people who are, involved and active, most of their creative content actually comes when they're older. Why is that? It's because, as we age, we accumulate information and experiences. And if we take care of our health, if we eat the right kind of foods, and if we exercise, and more importantly, if all of this is done in a context of living a very cognitively active lifestyle, all of these experiences, they get, they merge together into a beautiful story, and content is created. So no, in our clinic, in our work, we want to make sure that we tell people that just because you're getting old doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have cognitive decline. Yes, there are certain things that do get, hit real hard. When it comes to neurological symptoms, the speed of processing or the speed of retrieval of information in our brain, that gets slowed down. But things like vocabulary, things like getting information, putting it together, and creating, a thought, that gets better. Vocabulary gets better. So, and when you look at different people who have lived long enough and are cognitively vibrant, when they speak, you hear that. And even in their neuropsychological testing, they actually do very, very well.
The concept of wisdom. So what's the mechanism of that? I mean, wisdom, I call it three-dimensional processing. So as you get older, many milliseconds slowness in processing and things of that nature, but your vocabulary is expanded, but your contextual thinking, meaning that all this history that you accumulated, this ideas, perspectives, and overlaying of these concepts becomes so much more robust and powerful than any 18-year-olds. Whenever we give talks, I say, I hope there are no 18-year-olds here in the audience, because I'm about to tell you, a cognitively vibrant and healthy 80-year-old is a complete different species than a 15, 16, 17, or 18-year-old, no matter how smart that teenager is, because the level of thinking is a three-dimensional thinking, contextual thinking. And that's what I want people to take out of this, is that you can live not just to survive and, well into your 80s and 90s, but much more cognitively vibrant lives. But it takes planning. It takes living healthfully through nutrition, exercise, stress management, sleep, restorative sleep, and avoiding things like sleep apnea, and significant cognitive activity. Keep your mind active. We say don't retire, rewire. Keep the mind active throughout life, even if you're in the age of retirement, because that makes the connections. But at the base, start, whatever your age, start eating healthy, because no amount of vitamins, or when in our clinic, the patients come in with these bags and bags of vitamins. I say you can have 5 bags. In fact, you're first of all, you're poisoning yourself, because we now know that a lot of these vitamins, even in low amounts, if taken exogenously, they can be toxic, or they can actually even cause cancer, and so on and so forth. So, but nothing compares to a proper, well-balanced, and a diet that includes all the elements. And that's the message to give, that you can build your brain well into your 80s, 90s, and beyond.
That's so encouraging. And I love that saying, don't retire, rewire. Is it true that certain activities can actually help rewire the brain? I've often heard people say that doing certain types of yoga or meditation, or even crafts or puzzles, can help people with brain health.
Staying cognitively active is incredibly important. What we found out from our studies, Dean and I actually did a meta-analysis, one of the largest meta-analysis, to look at what kind of brain activities actually creates those connections. And we found out that, it has to be something that, first of all, people like doing, and it has to be complex, challenging, and connect it to one's purpose in life. It was kind of it was interesting that when we were writing the book, The Alzheimer's Solution, we talked about nutrition and provided all kinds of research for it, and exercise and stress management and sleep. And when it came to cognitive activity, everything was centered around one's purpose. It actually became almost a chapter about the importance of purpose, because that's where all the activities emanate from. You're not going to do an activity if you're not enjoying it, if it's not connected to your story and what you want to do. So it could be something as straightforward as playing cards or puzzles, but better is something that is related to your life story, whether it's volunteering, whether it's working in your job environment, taking on projects that are complex and challenging towards a specific goal. It's about staying connected to your loved ones and creating projects around that. So yes, cognitive activity is very important, and whatever brings one joy and whatever it helps you drive towards that vision that you have for your life is the best.
The key is, though, it has to be challenging, because it's the challenging part, the complexity that pushes the brain to connect. You build muscles by working out the muscle. You build brain by working out the brain. If you're doing, weightlifting, and if you just stay at 2 pounds, after a while, you're not only not building muscle, you're just wasting your time. Same thing with cognitive activity. It has to be purpose driven, because we talk about the concept that we've actually brought a completely different perspective: good stress and bad stress. So, and the only difference is your perspective, or whether it's driven by your purpose or not. So if it's good stress, it's driven by your purpose, and your brain interprets it differently, sends them a different message to your hypothalamus, which sends a different message to your pituitary, which then sends, the pituitary is the hormone central, right? From growth hormone to insulin to thyroid, to everything is controlled for that. But it all starts with your perception of that stress. If it's your stress, no matter how challenging, it actually grows the brain and actually builds your body. But if it's bad stress, which is not driven by your purpose, doesn't have direction, doesn't have a timeline, it actually affects the hypothalamus and the pituitary differently. And you destroy the brain and the body. So it starts with that purpose. One of the things is, playing a musical instrument, learning. But if you just started playing, let's say, piano, and you're stuck at 4 chords and you're good at 4 chords, the next step is going to 5 chords. If you're learning cooking, if you're sticking to the same dishes over and over again, well, you're not building anymore. You have to push that. And that's what creates those 30,000 connections per neuron. There's actually literally nothing in the body as powerful as that fact, that by pushing your brain around your purpose and giving it the right environment with food, you make 30,000 connections per neuron of 87 billion neurons, which means you're basically protected against Alzheimer's or any dementia.
Wow, that's amazing. That's very encouraging. When we go to the doctor, typically the doctor will take our temperature, they'll take our pulse, they will take our blood pressure, they'll weigh us. But how do we know if we even have brain health? Like, who do we go to for that? And how, is there a test what should we do to assess our brain health at this point?
I'm really glad you asked that question, because everybody thinks that when the symptoms of memory problems starts, that's when the disease actually started. That's when the problem actually arises. And Dean has a very interesting way of addressing that. He says, and we both say, that it's not one point. It's actually a journey of brain health, and it depends on where you are. And our goal is to make sure that we are far away from that the precipice where the cognitive decline starts. So with healthy lifestyle, you're basically stepping back from that edge of the cliff as much as possible. And with unhealthy lifestyle, you actually get closer and closer. So, we all, in many ways, have some cognitive disease at any point in our life, and our job should be to stay as healthy as possible.
Wow. Is it true that our brains actually change with exposure to these unhealthy foods?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, it actually starts in your stomach. So now we know that certain foods, because the relationship between stomach and the brain is so profound, we're just beginning to learn about that. And we knew that the vagus nerve, one of the cranial nerves, actually connects to the stomach, but there's much more than that. The neural network in the stomach is almost as complex as the brain. And so it starts in the stomach when the foods that we eat actually start creating certain chemical byproducts that sends a message that gives you anxiety or even affects your depression proclivities or tendencies. So even before getting to the brain, in the stomach, they start affecting the system. So once it gets further up into the system, now it starts affecting your neurotransmitters. It starts, we're talking again, I'm going to repeat, with every meal, with a single meal, too much sugar, and then it affects the brain in a completely different way. With every meal, the neurotransmitters are affected, the neurons are affected, the connections are affected. If you have too much sugar, one of the stories we tell, because we deal with young people as well, you send these young men, hunter-gatherers or women, send them to class to stay quiet for 8 hours with another 30 people, but you've given them a sugary, fatty breakfast. And then you expect them to stay calm. And if they don't, you give them all the diagnosis of ADD or ADHD. And then you medicate them to calm them down. How about food? How about we start there? I'm not saying that all ADDs are food related, but a profound number of them are food related. So we know that the foods that we're used to for from, I think it's starting in the 1940s and 50s, these cereals, these sugary cereals, these bacon and eggs and all these things which are full of fat and full of sugar, it's affecting the child at a time where they're growing the brain, and affects them at the most vulnerable time in the morning. And then we expect a different outcome. And it affects them emotionally, it affects them structurally, it affects them long-term and short-term. And nobody wants to talk about that. Now we're seeing papers where we're seeing inflammation of the brain with obesity, with insulin resistance in children as young as 12 and even younger. One study showed that ApoE4 is a gene that increases your risk of Alzheimer's, but it's not an Alzheimer's gene because ApoE4 is related to lipid metabolism. So it's actually your body's ability to metabolize lipids properly, right? So if you have bad genes, we say, then assume you have bad genes and don't eat a lot of fat. But so they looked at ApoE4 and they looked at 2-year-olds. And guess what? Even 2-year-olds had lower IQ and 3-year-olds had lower IQ, younger kids. We believe it didn't have anything to do with ApoE4. We believe that it had to do with the food and its interaction with that gene. So we really have to start the conversation about food and its effect on brain ahead of anything else, and not just wait till people are in their 60s. From birth, teenage years, midlife, and beyond, food's going to affect the most sensitive, the most energy hungry organ of them all, the brain, more than anything else.
And more importantly, all of our habits are actually created during that age. We carry these habits well into our 80s, 90s. And that's the time when parents and the society in general has to focus on creating healthy eating habits because of obviously, creating that brain and also carrying that habit forward.
So, are there any particular foods within the whole food plant-based diet, like blueberries or kale, that we should be focusing on for brain health?
That's a tough one. There are just so many good ones. But when you look at dietary patterns, so everybody, I'm pretty sure you've seen that too. Mediterranean diet comes up over and over again when it comes to brain health. Mediterranean diet is great for brain health, so on and so forth. And then you look at the magazine, and there's this enormous fish and cheese and wine, stuck to that article, and that's not true. So I had the opportunity to work with a very large database called the California Teacher Study, and I was very intrigued about how Mediterranean diet was defined. And when you look at the scoring system, which highlights the foods that are good for the brain and shows the foods that are bad for the brain, so here it is. foods that are good for the brain, or people actually get a higher score on, are fruits, vegetables, whole grains, nuts and seeds, legumes and beans, obviously, and sources of omega-3 fatty acids. Foods that are bad for the brain are meats, cheeses, dairy products, and any source of food that is high in saturated fat. So what does that look like? It looks like whole food plant-based diet.
Yeah.
And when you look at the inflammatory index of the food, so the foods that are highest in anti-inflammatories, that have the highest nutrient density, is good for brain health. But the same goes for heart. The same goes for all the other chronic diseases of aging. So on top, you have things like greens, you have berries, you have beans, you have whole grains, and I think we all agree that category of foods that provide the most amount of nutrients and that are actually low in the calorie are the best.
So why is it that they keep, bringing up Mediterranean diet, where in reality the scoring system behind it is plant-based, whole food plant-based, is because it's politically and it's more sexy and all of that, but it's actually behind the Mind diet. It's the whole food plant-based component. Behind Mediterranean diet, it's the whole food plant-based component. Her study, which was the largest study, and she won the American Heart Association as a researcher award for it, showed repeatedly that a whole food plant-based diet reduced your chance of stroke by 44%.
Yeah.
I mean, this is one of the biggest epidemics, strokes, on nearly 800,000 per year. We don't have a single drug. We keep giving, after a $40,000 workup after a stroke, you give them an aspirin and a lipid-lowering drug and send them home. Yet here we have data that shows that a whole food plant-based diet reduces your chance of stroke by 44%. Why is that not on the cover of Time magazine?
Yeah.
Because they have coffee with butter on the cover of Time magazine.
That's it. Exactly.
There you go.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Oh my God. So grain brain, what say you about that?
We say that it's junk science. In fact, many people have shown that it's junk science. It's confirmation bias science. There's a group of doctors, maybe overtly, maybe not knowingly, maybe wishfully, are giving a larger percentage of population the kind of data that they want to hear, the kind of things that they want to hear, that meat is good, meat, or it's okay. Or I love the statement, I don't know who said it, that people love to hear good news about their bad habits. So these doctors are out there just to do that, so they can get enough clicks, enough followers on Instagram, and enough, then they will create whole programs around that. And that's unethical, that's wrong, there's no science for it. You can make the argument that, okay, a little bit of that, but you can't make a database that says grains are bad. Where is your data? In fact, there is no data.
It's actually on the contrary. Whole grains are great for your brain. It lowers your risk of stroke. It lowers your risk of vascular dementia. So
yeah.
Thank you so much. Could you talk a little bit about the neurobiology of food addiction as it relates to obesity and behavioral change?
So this is interesting, because addiction is, so what is addiction? So there's a pathway that actually is fed where it circumvents your ability to stop yourself. So your frontal lobe, the function of your frontal lobe, I'm simplifying it, but is to stop you from doing things. When a process circumvents that, goes around that because it's so strong, then you're addicted. I mean, I'm simplifying, but that's basically it. But in many ways, we're all, to some extent, addicted to certain things, right? Oxygen and food, because it's a survival thing. But when it's connected to chemical processes that does not allow you to control it, or does not allow your frontal lobe to control it, it becomes an addiction. So coming back to limbic system, which is your emotional brain, and then the frontal lobe, which is your, for all purposes, your cognitive brain, or what controls everything. These two are interacting and battling all the time. And whenever there is a dysfunctional behavior that's reinforced more, the limbic system takes over. And within that limbic system, there's a chemical which is used for many things, which is dopamine. But the addictive pathway of dopamine is triggered and you're stuck in that pathway. Sorry, I complicated that. But basically, it's a dysfunctional pathway that's instigated by, in this case, food. And what Aisha said earlier, these habits that we create early on in our teen years are habits that are reflex pathways. Now, you remember that brain that we said you consumes 25% of your body's energy? Well, it doesn't want to use a lot of energy. So it doesn't want to, and it uses most of the energy when it's thinking. So it wants reflex behavior. It wants just habit pathways.
To save energy.
To save energy. And those habit pathways are set in your teenage years. I mean, when we give talks, we say, you want to be stuck with your teenage habits. So it's time to reprogram the brain. Because those habits, those bad habits that fed some part of you, some need, some dysfunctional need, were set in your teenage life, sometimes later, but usually in the teenage life. And that is actually directly connected to your dopamine system and to your emotional brain. And those pathways are stuck now. In this case, we're talking about food. So the only way that you can break that pathway, that addictive pathway, is to start slowly reprogramming it. In fact, in our study, what we do is we actually make people write their diaries. This time, of course, we sit down with them to make sure that they're doing a good job. And then we break down what element of the food was the thing that actually created that pathway in the first place. For some people, it was sugar. For some people, it's fat. For some people, it's something else. But it was actually usually early on in life that pathway started. And it had to do with some emotional element that was connected to that. It's usually not the food. It was the emotional connection. And if you don't find that emotional link, you will never be able to break through the addiction. So in a way, you have to sit down and identify that link between the emotional thing and the food early on. What a lot of diet programs do is just say, oh, just stop eating fat and stop eating sugar and you're going to be fine. That's why we keep failing over and over and over again. In fact, the failure rate is almost 90% in a lot of the programs because you don't get to the causal root of it, which is that an emotional connection to the food that started early on.
Wow. It seems that so many people know what to do, but they just have trouble implementing this. Why is it so hard for people to make permanent lifestyle changes?
Because of that very fact. Because the problem is down here, we try to pick it up over here, and it always, derails. Because if you don't get it at the core, that those emotional circuits are so powerful, those triggers are so powerful that without you knowing, they're going to put you back. And then once you fail, then you feel defeated and you're less likely to be able to go back to the process. So you have to get to the core process. And it's almost, although we're neurologists and we're staying away from psychology, but it is a psychological process.
Absolutely.
You have to do a little bit of a deep search as far as going back to your teen years or sometime, or even maybe earlier, to find out what was that relationship? What is the trigger? If you can't go that far back, then here, what is the trigger? Let's say it's sugar for you. For me, when I used to get, all of us have it, first of all. So we all have some kind of trigger, maybe not as powerful to the point of addiction, but it is dysfunctional. Every time, even if I had food at home, at work, I would come home. As soon as I got to the home, I would open the refrigerator door. Why is that the case? And this is a person who's a behaviorist, who's a neurologist, who knows food. I have a master's in nutrition. What's going on? It's that powerful, irrespective, because something in my childhood, maybe good or bad, as soon as I got home, my mother, I always blame it on my mother, so she hates that. My mother probably fed me, and that relationship actually stuck, and it became dysfunctional. And so if I couldn't go back to the beginning, I identified the relationship, though. It's me coming home, and that's where the mistake, the breakdown of the process was. So I would have to break that process. When I got home, instead of going to the fridge, awareness, Aisha usually help, then we find another way to do something else that satisfied that emotional need. All of us have that dysfunctional relationship that created a pathway, a short circuit pathway that fed that addiction. If you can't identify the core, which would be actually ideal, then what you can do is identify the behavior, the trigger, the behavior, the reward. The trigger, the behavior, the reward. The trigger, break down the behavior. So in the past, the trigger was me coming in the house, seeing the fridge. The behavior was me opening the fridge and eating. Well, no, now as soon as I come home, see that, we go out, get a coffee, get a drink of a tea or coffee, get something healthy, and go on a walk. So after a while, you create a new circuit. Trigger, new behavior, reward. Trigger, new behavior, reward. That's and habits don't happen. Nowadays it's popular 21-day challenge or 20. No, some behaviors take longer. Giving up sugar is going to take longer because sugar is incredibly addictive. Giving up cheese because of its casomorphine and all this is going to take longer. Let it take as long as it takes, but you have to break that cycle over and over and over again until the new trigger behavior response becomes the baseline habit. Without that, there's no way to just cold turkey do things.
Wow. So what would you say to someone who's given up hope that they could ever lose weight?
There's always hope, especially when it comes to food. I spoke about it earlier about this trigger response outcome and reward. But first of all, we have to know that everybody has to know that the damage that weight and obesity and diabetes and cholesterol, all these things do, not just for your outcomes like a stroke and dementia, but depression and anxiety, all of these are related to that. So knowing that should be an impetus. Then the second thing is take one habit at a time. Don't worry about the weight. Worry about what led to the weight, or more importantly, what's leading to sustaining that weight. Identify the elements and take one thing at a time. So my least favorite word in English language is motivation. It is such an elitist word because the rest of us who are doing X, Y, and Z, we feel like, great, I have the motivation. Well, motivation is not magical. There was something that went on ahead of time that created that behavior. Here's breakdown of motivation. Motivation, when functionally created, and everybody is, when you have a clear, measurable goal, you repeatedly create patterns of success towards that goal, small increments of success. When you repeat that enough times, it becomes a habit, then that becomes your new set point. If we can build programs around just that, so forget about the word motivation, forget about the scare tactics or this or that.
Willpower.
Yeah. Identify what's bad. That we will tell you. You will tell them better than anybody else. It's whole food, plant-based. You'll create beautiful products. Aisha is also a chef. Foods they will never feel deprived. Identify what you need to change specifically. If it's sugar for this next few months, identify it, quantify it, create positive behaviors towards it. That's your goal. Forget about weight because the weight will happen. Once you create a pattern of success and habits, the rest will follow. So don't worry about this fact that you're overweight by X number of weights, because then it in itself becomes daunting. When you throw that away and find out what's leading to that excessive weight and how you can systematically break that, and more importantly, how you can create habits to maintain that, that's a new paradigm.
Great. So Dr. Sherzai, what is the real truth about weight loss?
The real truth about weight loss is that it's a process, that it is almost mechanical, that it's just like Dean said, small steps towards a major goal. And for people who are, in a situation where they are struggling, that, weight gain or obesity or being overweight has become a problem, that they should never lose hope, and that there's always a way to get there. And also, I think it's important for people not to compare themselves to somebody else, because everybody is in their own journey. And it's about creating very small steps of success and continue to succeed in that path.
Thank you so much. I so enjoyed talking to both of you.
Likewise. Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.
My pleasure.